Hey, what's up, everybody? It's CJ and Kevin from the Stainless team, and we are answering some developer questions today. So, one question that we get all the time is, should I write my SDK by hand, or should I use a generator like Stainless? And we're going to just talk through some of those decision points. So, Kevin, maybe you could dive in and tell us like what I should really be thinking about when I go into this decision.
Yeah, for sure. And CJ, I will answer your question with another question, which is to ask you like what kind of SDK you're building. So if your SDK is like mostly a typed wrapper, like over the top of a REST API or some kind of API that you're accessing over the network, then very probably you should try to use an SDK generator to build that SDK. Mostly because the interacting with an API over HTTP, especially, is not like differentiated work that's like very particular to your API, but doing it well is very important. So, like, you still want to do things like, you know, back like doing like back offs where like after a failed request you wait a little while before you make the next one, and like not overloading an api endpoint as a result of doing that. You might want to pool your http connections, support like different timeouts, have like consistent error handling behavior. So there is actually like quite a bit of business logic involved in like just interacting with an http api at a level of excellence that you don't necessarily want to reinvent as a part of providing like an interface to your particular REST API. The other big reason why you want to do it is you want to make sure that the types and like object model that you provide to your users is always like up to date with the actual reality of your API. So one of the big reasons why you want to provide like a SDK at all for like your HTTP API is to provide like typed objects like in the programming languages that your developers are using, so that they can see what the shape of these objects are that they're working with from your API. And if you are using a generator like a Stainless to create those objects, they're being generated from an open API specification, which is kind of your source of truth for like what is actually in the API. So because those objects are always generated from that spec, you have a high degree of confidence that like the objects that your users are interacting with like actually match reality. And having that single source of truth just unto itself is like a useful thing, because you can use that spec to generate docs. You can use it for like generating tests against your API. Like having your API documented in OpenAPI ends up just being a virtuous thing, sort of generally. Um, Another thing that you get like when you use a generator is like support for languages that you wouldn't necessarily be able to develop for otherwise. So like if you're on an API platform team, you're providing this REST API, chances are excellent that like as a part of your team, you have maybe Python developers, JavaScript developers, maybe you have some Go developers mixed in there just for fun. So maybe you could support SDKs in those languages. But like, do you have like a PHP expert, a C# expert, a Java expert? Maybe not. So you are able to then like provide like a nice HTTP client experience to developers in languages that are not among the ones that your API platform team happens to have. And kind of the other reason why like you like this is helpful is like generally if you are providing this API, your job is to like work on the actual backend services that power the API, like the things that the API actually does, whether it's sending text messages, making payments, completing a chat if you are building a generative AI API. That's the stuff that actually matters to your API. So like the types and the juggling of HTTP requests and like server sent events isn't necessarily like critical to the success of your API. But like it's not always the case that like a generator is the right thing. So like CJ, I know like you've worked on a couple of these SDKs, or you like just like as an integrator where like they're very business logic heavy, and like maybe not a great fit for this
Mhm.
type of thing.
Yeah, I love that. So I guess the answer to the first is like when you're thinking about what kind of SDK you're building, the first question is, are you wrapping a HTTP API? And there's going to be cases when that's not the thing that you're building. You're not wrapping HTTP API. Maybe most of the SDK is actually business logic. And yeah, we had a couple examples of this when we were working with open source maintainers who built layers of business logic on top of the Stripe APIs. And so maybe this is an example too from OpenAI, where you have like the agents SDK, or you have sort of these other wrappers that are layers well above the API. And so yeah, a lot of times you'll get these libraries that have business logic that does not involve directly working with an API. Would also, like, when you think about generating an SDK, having an artifact to go from is a really important component to thinking about whether or not you can generate it. Because oftentimes, if you're interacting with a browser API or you're interacting with a device, there aren't specifications that you can use to automatically generate for. And so oftentimes, if it's heavy business logic or if it's interacting directly with a framework or a platform, I think that's probably a case where it'd be really challenging to generate an SDK. I guess
Yeah.
I'm sort of curious, like, your opinion, where it might be a little bit of both. Like, you have like an SDK or a developer tool that is doing some HTTP interactions. It's wrapping an API in many ways, but also has like really heavy client logic for maybe like error monitoring and reporting or logging, or some of these other use cases where it's like kind of half and half maybe. So yeah, maybe how should we think about that sort of use case?
Yeah, which definitely happens like a decent chunk of the time. Like there maybe you're in your SDK, the actual API interaction, like the thing that's going over the network, is not like maybe that exciting or that complex, or maybe it's just like a single endpoint. Like if you're like a Sentry, say, and you're like doing instrumentation for observability or handling whatever, and you have like a single API endpoint that you're using to like send events to. Most of your SDK probably isn't like all about that HTTP API. But even so, like you should probably still use like a SDK generator or something like a stainless, just because like that component, you still could sort of like treat as a little bit of a black box, like within your SDK, where like the types are always going to be accurate. Like the interaction over the network is going to be like pretty robust. And then you can sort of focus your efforts like on the actual like business logic that sort of drives most of your SDK. So like this hybrid thing is certainly a viable option, which makes sense like a lot of the time. But if you are building something that is just logic, like you mentioned, like the OpenAI agents SDK, that's its own thing. Like it's not based on an existing like API specification. So the product really is the business logic. Like you're encoding like a set of processes in JavaScript code. So that actually makes a lot of sense to kind of distribute as its own SDK, and to probably like build it and completely maintain it by hand. So CJ, one thing we hear a lot is like, guys, this is great. Like, I'm sure like you love your little SDK generator, but my API is too complex. Like, it is doing too much crazy stuff.
Mhm.
There's no way in which a SDK generator could possibly accommodate my needs. When is that true? Do you think? Like, do you think there's anything to that argument?
I think a lot of the time people expect their API to have a lot of really special things going on. And oftentimes there's a lot of similar patterns that you'll see across HTTP, regardless of what API framework you're using or what language you're using. And so whether you're doing some special serialization or deserialization, or sort of like encryption and de-encryption, or if you're using a really interesting format instead of JSON or XML or something. I think more often than not, a lot of these APIs are going to work very, very similarly across the board. And so a lot of times it's not the API that's too complex, I would say. We have I think there's people generating SDKs on Stainless that have hundreds of endpoints, and so these are very, very complex in terms of like number of operations, very complex APIs. But yeah, when we're talking about like um, the underlying mechanics of how to integrate or interact with an API being too complex, I think that's often a misconception that a lot of folks have. Um, and
Yeah.
yeah, like I don't know, you're curious your take too.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you there probably are going to be in some cases like your API does something pretty novel and special, or there's just something weird that it does for legacy reasons, like in a code path that you can't touch because it's going to break horribly if you poke at it too hard. So in those cases, like you still want to have like the flexibility to write custom code. So if you are going to generate an SDK, you want to be able to do it like using technology that will let you kind of drop in with custom code wherever you need to put it. So like part of like how the Stainless SDK generator works is you can apply custom code kind of to anywhere within like the generated code as well. So like even within like the bits of code that are making HTTP requests or like setting up headers before the request, you can customize that code too. And what the generator does is it uses like Git to essentially like take your commits like for your custom code and like reapply them after the code is generated, such that like you can actually like customize line by line like even the code that's generated from like in the SDK. Generally speaking, you want to be like careful about that and like kind of dip in there and then like call out to custom code that's somewhere else, just to avoid like merge conflicts and stuff like that. But you do kind of have the ability to kind of jump in and customize code like anywhere in the stack. And I do think that's important because a lot of times APIs will need some, special home cooking to actually expose everything that's going on in there.
Mhm.
So another thing we hear at CJ a lot is like, well, generated code is junk. Like, I won't be able to put this in front of my customers. Like there's no way. Do you think there's anything to that argument specifically?
I think a lot of the off the shelf SDK generation tools that have been around for many, many years will generate code that is very hard to read. And Stainless was started by Alex Rattray, who came from Stripe. And when we were working together at Stripe, it was really important that the Stripe SDKs felt like they were handcrafted. And so when the SDK generation pipeline was built originally, it was built to generate the SDKs that were already being hand maintained. And so we weren't like taking something off the shelf and then generating it and use that. Instead, what we were doing was building a generation pipeline that would generate these really beautiful Stripe SDKs. And we've taken a lot of what we learned at Stripe and brought it inside of Stainless. And so one of the sort of like core beliefs and things that we try to focus very, very hard on is making sure that Stainless generated code looks like it was written by an expert in a given language. And so you're going to have some like really idiomatic, beautiful, great developer experience that comes out of that generated code. And to your point, like if there are components or helpers or pieces that you still want to write by hand because you can't necessarily describe them with an open API spec, you can still add those sort of like porcelain interfaces with custom code inside of your Stainless generated SDKs, which I really like being able to kind of like extend it to your own liking. To add whatever helpers that you think developers are going to need, because at the end of the day it's all about just building this great developer experience to make sure that people can get onboarded and integrate faster. So I gave a talk a few years ago. I think you were at that conference in Colorado, and it was all about generating like these really beautiful bespoke SDKs. And so it's funny that we're coming full circle here and talking about how like oftentimes these off the shelf generators that have been around for a very long time, the code that they generate is very like machine readable, but not very human readable. And we think that it's important that developers can sort of pop the hood, take a look at the code that's being generated, and be able to read it as if it was written by someone on their team. So,
For
yeah.
sure. And paradoxically, like it also helps like language models generate code as well. Like if they can actually like read the code, understand what it does, and like be able to successfully guess like, oh, like this is the way I need to put these method calls together in order to accomplish whatever task I'm going to accomplish. Like having human readable code also means that it's like language model readable code as well, which is ends up being handy. Another lever you have, like if at least like if you're generating an SDK with Stainless, is like within the Stainless config, which kind of contains all the SDK specific stuff. Where like, and that this is kind of just like a design choice Stainless made, where like the Open API spec is kind of the source of truth for like the shape of your HTTP API, but like the stuff that like like sort of dedicates like, or excuse me, dictates like how your SDK functions exists in the Stainless config. Where so in that configuration, you can say like, well, for this endpoint, I want to make the namespace in Python be this, or I want the method name for the post function to be generate instead of create. So there's a decent amount of configuration you have there, like in addition to like creating the aliases for the really important one. So a million years ago, I hand wrote the Twilio SDK for Node.js when Node was still in version 0.8. And one of my like I had like sort of a fluent interface that looks actually a lot like Stainless SDKs today, for like the larger paths in the HTTP API.
Mhm.
But there was like a top level client function for send message, and because like that post to slash messages like in the larger API was probably the single most important API endpoint in the entire thing. So making that single endpoint as easy as possible to access is super possible, like is super important, and is definitely possible if you have custom code at your
Mhm.
fingertips. So CJ, another thing we hear a lot, right, is like, the handwritten SDKs. They're always going to be better than the generated ones. I know my SDK that I wrote by hand back before TypeScript was a thing, because I don't need your types telling me that like my beautiful untyped like object literals are incorrect. Um, but like we know that those like handwritten SDKs are always going to be better, right? Like that's honestly like probably kind of true, isn't it?
I think if you have potentially, this is assuming though one thing, and that is that you have experts in all of the languages across all of the ecosystems that you want to support. Uh, if you have a massive company where you have those resources to throw at it, I think um, that might be true. You can have an expert C# developer on one team, and an expert Java dev, and Kotlin dev, and uh, all across the board. You have experts that can put in the time as full-time employees to build uh, and write SDKs that I think we talked about earlier, that like this is actually not that differentiated, right? Like interacting with your API is not that differentiated. And instead, it would probably be better for those devs to be investing time into actually like building out what the API does behind the scenes. And so, yes, I think it is going to be true that if you have the expertise to manually write an SDK, then it can be great. I think another piece of the puzzle here, though, is also like maintaining um, maintaining the shape of the SDK as the API evolves over time. And it can be really challenging to make sure that we're following the same naming conventions, we're following the same patterns in the SDK that we have for the last 10 years. And so if you don't have someone on the team that is continuing to keep that up to date, that can be really, really challenging to keep up with. So yeah, it's like I could be an ideal use case if you've got a giant team of experts who are always going to be around and give you consistent output. However, I think yeah, depending on a generator can be much more scalable, and it's a better way to meet your end developers where they are by creating beautiful SDKs in all the languages that they're going to expect them in.
Yeah, for sure. Like accuracy is like a fairly important part of DX generally too. Like you can have like a beautifully designed API, but like if it doesn't actually like reflect the current state of like the HTTP API that you're using, it kind of doesn't matter. Like if your end user gets like a 400 bad request error back because like you didn't add a property to the API, or like the property changed or whatever, that's going to be a bad developer experience as well. Or if like your code snippets aren't up to date in the documentation, and like what's in your SDK is different than what's in the docs because they're not based on the same source of truth, like that's also a bad developer experience. So there's actually like more aspects of DX to consider than just like, is this API beautifully designed? And it should be. And like, I think you should think really hard about that. But accuracy and like consistency across like different developer interfaces that you're providing is also super important. And yeah, and I think like having SDK support like across languages is also super important. C# developers deserve love too. So
Yeah.
like you shouldn't just have like a nice SDK for Python and JavaScript because it's what your teams happen to know.
Mhm.
Like helping developers across different languages get started quickly is helpful. And not everyone can be as lucky as we were. So I worked on the SDKs at OpenAI, and our .NET SDK for C# had an entire dedicated team at Microsoft, like working on it, maintaining it, and they generated parts of it, but they maintained like large swaths of it by hand. So that was a luxury that, like, maybe if you're Sam Altman and your buddies with the higher ups at Microsoft, like you can have that, but most of us can't. So.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, maybe we can wrap it up by going back through the decision points. So it really matters what kind of SDK you're building. Is it actually wrapping in HTTP API, or is it more business logic? And sometimes it might be a little bit of both. Um, if it's complex, maybe you want to like question whether that complexity is really going to cause a problem, or if there's like little escape hatches where you can benefit from generation while still having the ability to extend. And then recognizing that generated code is, using these legacy off-the-shelf generators can be a bad developer experience, but you know, the you can get the handwritten, handcrafted feel by generating with a generator like Stainless, and offer those across lots and lots of different languages for devs in many different ecosystems. Was there anything I missed there, or like does that seem
Yeah, I
to
think you
sum up
did a
the?
pretty good job putting a cherry on it. But
All right.
yeah, it really is a situation where like you can have your cake and eat it too. Like you can generate large swaths of your SDK, probably without configuring a lot, but also like still like for those like critical interfaces, still have enough control to kind of make them do whatever whatever you'd like them to do. So. Yeah, I think we're that's probably a good place to wrap us up. But
Okay.
we did want to take some time to answer one of these common questions. Thanks for hanging out with us, and hopefully we'll talk to you again real soon.
Yep. Thanks for your time and attention. We'll see you next time.